So thank you everybody for coming. My name is Don Daglow, and we're going to talk about some forgotten lessons from game history. And I don't know if you had the chance to be here for Glenn Schofield's talk that just wrapped up, but listening him talk about the process of introducing story into games reminded me actually of back when I was in university, because I thought I was going to be a playwriting major. I was studying for the theater, not for games, before I discovered computers and games. And I was thinking about this when Glenn was telling his story about asking artists, where is the story in each item? Because as a writer, I would bring to my professor each week all the work I had done. And we would discuss last week's work. So I'd bring in new things, we'd discuss the last work, and then I'd bring in something new next week. And I learned very quickly working with him. He had worked for the Royal Shakespeare Festival in the UK. And I learned very quickly that he was always going to come back and ask me the question, you have a character who walks into the room and he's angry. Why is he angry? Oh, I can answer that. I'm excited. I can answer this question for my professor. My character is angry because he has been betrayed. And who betrayed? I could answer these questions. And he said, what is it that makes him angry like this? Is he always angry? Is he sometimes angry? Is he almost never angry? He's almost never angry. And what has his life been like that he didn't get angry very often? Was he wealthy, or was he happy, or what did he come from? Well, he was almost never angry because, and my professor would say, go back to work. You don't know about your character. You only know what he's doing in that room. You don't know what your character did before he got to that room or who he is. I'm not talking to you about this anymore until you go back and you do that background. So I think it's interesting to see that across the games business, we have those same traditions of storytelling that we are taught about the idea that there is a story, and the story doesn't begin just when our game begins. The story doesn't begin just when the film or the play begins. The story starts long before. And that's how we create, both in games and in other media, stories that last. So I took that away. It was great fun from Glenn's talk. So I'm going to be talking, my background is as a game designer, but I've led studios for many years. So my background, one reason I can talk about history is I'm old, so I've lived through a lot of it. So I was one of the lucky ones who, back in 1971, got to be one of the first university students who was allowed to touch a computer. And so I immediately started writing games because, of course, that's what we're meant to do. In the 80s, when the industry began, I got one of the first jobs, one of the original 5 programmers at Mattel. And then I got recruited into a little company, excuse me, called Electronic Arts, which was a nice little startup. So I have been very, very fortunate. So as somebody who I think of myself as a designer first and foremost, I'm actually going to be talking about the business today. A lot of things about how our world works, because we would love to be in a cocoon, in a protected environment, where all we can do is think about the creative of games, but we have much larger issues of the industry as a whole that affect our lives, our jobs, and ultimately our families. And I'm going to talk a lot about those factors. So this is what I did from 71 to 2008. For the last 7 years, I've been advising teams around the world, both large publishers and tiny startups, and getting that double view of the way we see it from little indie teams on the one hand and big publishers on the other hand has been very helpful. So this does ask the question, I'm now in the 45th year of making games in my career. So this, one thing it tells me is it's too late for me to try a different career. I think at this point I'm pretty well decided in my career choice. But it begs the question, how retro can you go? in my case, this is how retro you can go. We were back at the point where not only did all we had was ASCII, but all we had was capital letters. So this is Dungeon from 1975, which was either the first computer RPG or one of them. And to make comments on retro, this is what I looked like in university in 1975. Yeah, I laugh too when I look at it. So there's an important quote that a lot of us hear, which is, those who cannot learn from the past are condemned to relive it. And I think we see ourselves doing this in games as we do it in other places in life as societies. So that's why I'm talking about these topics, because I'm thinking about how do we build an industry that will grow? How do we as individuals build careers where we can practice our creative crafts? So that's the background for this. So item one, I'm going to be sharing 5 ideas. And my objective is not to convince you that the ideas are right. Some of them are mathematical research. Others are pure opinion. Some allow me to move objects without touching them and make them fall to the ground. But my objective is not to convince you. Thank you for that chuckle. I heard that. My objective is not to convince you that necessarily I'm right. I love starting arguments. If you're debating and saying, no, he's crazy, no, this part's right, then my objective is met. What I want to do is have people think about things, discuss, and debate ideas, rather than necessarily agree. So idea number 1, we're going to talk about how much game consoles have cost over the last 30 years. Because out of that simple mathematical exercise, a lot of understanding can come from all these weird things that go on around us in the games business. And wild game pie has nothing to do with the video game business, but I just couldn't resist the opportunity to put up a photograph that talked about wild game pie. So, for example, talking about game prices, the Dreamcast, when it came out in 1999 to compete against the PS2, and to compete against the Xbox, it cost about $200. But we have to factor for inflation. And because in modern societies, each country or each region has some level of inflation in money. So in today's spending power in the United States, a $200 machine in 1999 would cost $286 today. So still not a really expensive console. Now, unfortunately, although it was inexpensive, the Dreamcast did not sell well. It was defeated in the market by the PlayStation 2 and by the Xbox. So low price alone for a nice box does not guarantee you success. Now we can go to the 3DO. 3DO comes out in 1993, and the objective of the 3DO was to be the first CD-based video game system. We had been really on cartridges and floppy disks. And the 3DO, the vision was, now we can go and we can use the power and the size of the CD for the first time. So it was $700 when it first came out. And what that meant is, in today's dollars, $1,672 for a video game console. It was also unsuccessful, in part because of its price, and in part because the PlayStation 1, the original PSX, filled that same function. And so it became the first great CD machine, and the 3DO was unsuccessful. So these are 2 cases of machines that were not successful. What are the prices for machines that are successful? So if we look at a chart now, so here we have the leading machine from each generation. We have the year they came out, how many millions of units they sold worldwide, the price they sold for when they came out, and at the end of 2014, the last complete year, in North America, what their prices would be. When I put this chart together, I was expecting the numbers to be fairly tight. I was not expecting this $129 window. So if you look at these machines from $349 to $468 in current dollars, is the success window for the best-selling platforms on each of these generations. That seems like a clear pattern, and yet if on my website I have the list of all the machines from this era, and it's amazing how many machines are outside this window over 30 years. Now, you'll notice I have both Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo on the chart because they fought to a draw, I think, in the early 90s. The Super Nintendo was more successful worldwide. In North America, the Sega was much more dominant. So I just put them both through. Now you'll notice, though, there's omission on this chart. We've got a generation missing. We've got the generation of the Wii, the PS3, and the Xbox 360 missing. That's because that generation of video games was a troubled generation. And in fact, it was troubled for a number of reasons, and that is a thread that is going to keep running through this discussion. Because suddenly, as of around 2006, 2007, 2008, a lot of things we always believed had been true turned out not to be true. And some patterns we thought had changed forever in the games business turned out they hadn't changed forever. They had only changed for a while. So when we add those machines to our chart, now we see a story where, oh, it looks like that was kind of a three-way tie. So the Wii had 101 million units, then 80, 84. Well, it's kind of, they divided up the marketplace, but no, those numbers, if you know, not as big as the PS2. You don't have 155 million units for one platform. But it looks like this was okay. But if we start to take it apart, we see all the places where this generation started to tear at the fabric of the games business. So if we start to pick that apart, first of all, if we look at it as game developers, and we'll come back to this in more detail, most of the games that were sold for the Wii were games that were developed by Nintendo. For all other publishers, all other developers other than Nintendo, that 101 million units was not that accessible. Not many games were sold by other people. So that big number doesn't mean the same thing as a lot of the other big numbers on the board because it wasn't as much of an opportunity for the game community at large. The numbers we see for the PS3 and for the Xbox 360 came into the cycle late, which I'll talk about more. So during much of the time, that market was smaller. Most important of all, when we look at the Wii, that 101 million units were all sold at a profit. Every machine that Nintendo sold, they made money on. When we look at the PS3 and the 360, most of those machines were sold at a loss because Sony and Microsoft are trying to develop the market. They had very complex and intricate machines that were very expensive to make, and so they were selling at a loss. So now we look at this cycle and we have, wait a second, we've got 100 million units sold at a profit competing against 160 million units, most of which were sold at a loss. Wait a second, the economic impact on the industry here is striking. This is not our normal story of competition. This is a case of the machine that was the lowest price, in fact, a price so low it was below our price window, dominating economically a generation, dominating in terms of money, over machines that were above our price window. And it's a case of simpler games with lower resolution graphics dominating over what we think of as more advanced and better games. So many illogical things going on. And part of what we're going to talk about today is why those illogical things happened. So this is why I come to my second law of console pricing. For conferences, I have fun with the idea of coming up with laws. And basically, it's about this window between 349 and 468, that narrow window. And you could say, well, gosh, I look at the charts. It should be obvious. If I'm a hardware company, I've got to be in that window. And you know that these companies have done all this same research. All this data is readily available. And what it just says is, really smart people can miss lessons from game history. And why? Because we fall in love with our products. We fall in love with our ideas. We fall in love with our babies because you care so much about the game you're working on. You care so much about the machine, the platform you're developing, that we lose perspective. And being able to keep that perspective and have both logic and passion living together inside you is part of how we build both great games and how we build our careers in the games business. So idea number 2. What business are we in? If you went and you got a business degree, you got a master's degree in business, typically this is a very important point you are taught. And you would have very stern and very serious professors of business. And they would have case studies of companies that failed. And they would demand that you explain why and how these companies failed and how you as a manager would have managed them differently so they succeeded. So I will portray the stern and severe professor of business. This was the best stern and severe photograph I could come up with of myself. I have no idea what I was saying when they took this picture, but I was very stern and severe about it. So we're going to start with 3 case studies. And they're represented by these 3 images. So one of them, I think most people recognize, the VHS tape. If we go back 25 years ago, VHS tapes were a very, very big business. But then what happened? CDs, DVDs came along, and the VHS tape business collapsed and went away. So billions and billions of dollars down to nothing. The image on the left is a buggy whip. So before we had cars, people would ride in wagons. Little ones were called buggies. And they would have horses pulling the wagon. And if you wanted the horse to go and you were a nice person, you would take the buggy whip and you would crack it and make a sound above the horse, and the horse would move. And if you weren't a nice person, then you would hit the horse with the whip and the horse would move. And so this was a big business because there were lots of horses and there were lots of wagons. But then what happens? We get cars. Now people are driving a car. You no longer have a wagon. You no longer have a buggy. You no longer have a horse. You no longer need a buggy whip. This was actually a pretty big business, and it collapsed and went away. The third one is obviously a feather, in this case an ostrich feather. If we go back 125 years, when women dressed up, they would have big wide hats, and very often they would have big ostrich feathers in them, dyed different colors. And so ostrich feathers were a big business, and this was for 20 years, this was a fashion. And so Australia produced ostriches and produced ostrich feathers. When World War I started, people from Europe and from the United States stopped sending ships to Australia for ostrich feathers. Fashions changed. Women's hats became smaller. They didn't have big feathers. And after the war, in both the United States and in Europe, the fashions didn't go back to the old-fashioned things. So one trick in games is watch the way that the fashion industry works, because the fashion industry is always moving forward. They will take things from the past. They will take retro ideas. Fashion is always changing and moving forward, even if technology is not. That's an instructional lesson for those of us in games, that society and culture are always changing. So what we do always has to change as well. So these are three industries, once very big, that collapsed. And so in business school, which I have not attended because I was learning business inside the games business, but when people are trained, they're told, this is a question of what business are you in? So what if the buggy whip makers didn't think they were making buggy whips? What if they said, no, we're in the travel accessories business? When people started to drive cars, they needed new things. Gloves for driving were something people really needed on those old cars without power steering. Buggy whips are made out of leather. Gloves are made out of leather. But buggy whip companies are saying, we make buggy whips. They limited the way they thought of what they do. They limited what they thought about what their craft was and what they make. So instead of saying, hey, we're leather workers, or we make travel accessories, they said, we make buggy whips. And if they thought that way, that was the end, because there were no more buggy whips to be made. For ostrich feathers, if somebody thought of themselves as being in women's fashion, there were many constantly new trends in women's fashion. Ostrich feathers went away, but many new things came in. So if people were stuck with ostrich feathers, such a narrow definition of their business. And even the ostrich farmers. Ostrich skin is a very expensive and popular material for purses and briefcases. So there's always ways to think about how to have a broader definition of your business. But if you think narrowly, you have problems. And then finally, we all know, what if the videotape and floppy disk companies thought of themselves as being in the data storage business? Data storage is a huge business. We make tape. That's what we know how to do. We're tape people. Very narrow, it's very dangerous. So let's bring this back to thinking about games. So before we had electronic games, we had board games. So here's an example of a football board game. I've done a lot of sports games. And sports games are a place where board games have really been hurt by computer games, because with computers we can do sports games better. But we had old football games like this. And in the United States, we'd have baseball games. This game was very important to me because I grew up in a family where there were a lot of problems, there was a lot of fighting, and every night there'd be yelling. And I wanted some place to get away. And this game, this was where I got away. This is where I ran to. I would just withdraw from the world. I was a shy, lonely, nerdy kid. And I would just go play my game every night for years. This game actually lasted 50 years as a product before finally computer games pushed it aside. But I played it for 6 years where it was just a big part of my life, from 64 to 70. So when I got to university and first had access to a computer, the first thing I did is I wrote a baseball game. I had actually redesigned the board game. I was 15. I had no idea I was going to be a game designer. But I redesigned my favorite board game to make it better. And when I got to college, this is what I started doing. Now, it probably seems strange to come to Europe and show a picture of baseball games. But I like to show this slide in my talks because it's the one place I can give you 40 years of game history on the same theme, all on one slide. So although it's not a European sport, it does let you see our craft developing over 4 decades. So up here, upper left, we've got the first text baseball game, which was the first interactive sports computer game of any kind, which I didn't know at the time. Then we go to the Atari and Intellivision games of the early 80s. These are the first video game console wars. And then I get a lot of credit for designing the first game that used camera angles, because at the start of video games, we had the idea of board games, and we would put a camera over the board, and we'd show you that action. And we might scroll around, but we were still in the board game thinking. And so the game in the upper right from 1983 is in television World Series baseball, where we actually used camera angles for the first time. And as I say, I get a lot of credit for doing that until people see this screen, because those graphics are so terrible, they just make you want to groan or laugh. But I can assure you, as the designer of this game, this figure right here, that is a human being. I promise you, that's a human being. So clearly, as we get into the 80s and get deeper in the 80s, we start to have games look more like real people. We start to have it really look like sports and television. And now, by the time we get to 2012, we're really at the point where our graphics look like you're watching something on television. The animations don't always look natural, but the still image looks like that. So most of these are games I worked on. This last one I did not, but my son worked in QA on that game, so I'm attached to it for a different reason. But now let's go back to football. And I want to bring out one of the big issues here that's very important for how we look at what business we are in. So if we go back and we look here at 2006 to 2012, so we've got FIFA on the PS2 at the end of the PS2 era. We've got FIFA PS3 late in the PS3 era. And if you look at these two images as a game maker, you look and go, okay, I see some differences. We've got higher resolution, cloth effects are different, lighting and shadow is being done differently, shaders, more figures on the field to take advantage of processor speed. But if you show these two images to an everyday person who is not a core gamer, not a big game fan, they go, oh yeah, no, that one's nicer. They're both really nice, but yeah, no, that one's nicer. You can tell the difference, but it's not like this. We spent 30 plus years teaching everybody that this is how our industry works. We continually are improving our graphics. What makes better games? Here you can see the progress. This is automatically better and better and better. And that's what we've been saying for 30 years. But then when we come back and we come up now to the current generation, again, as game makers, we can look up there and say, okay, I see what they're doing with cloth effects, shaders, obviously, more resolution, more figures. But we show this comparison between prior generation and current gen to an everyday person. And they're going, yeah, I guess it's not, yeah, I guess there's more people. They're both nice. Now we're really getting subtle. And the problem is that we've taught everybody to look for us to make things strikingly different, and we've reached an end point in which that avenue of defining our business as different doesn't work anymore, because we've matched the technology of the televisions that we all have in our homes. So this is why, one of the reasons why we see this problem, because in this generation of the Wii, the PS3, and the 360, we started to hit that wall. And the minute we hit that wall is the moment you have a machine that doesn't obey the rules suddenly take over a generation of hardware. The Wii broke all the rules. It was lower resolution, more primitive graphics. It had this weird gestural interface. It couldn't possibly succeed. It was an inexpensive machine in an era of really expensive tech to try and push things ahead. And it completely sabotaged everybody's plan for this generation. And in so doing, it changed the economics of the games industry. But it only could do it because Nintendo recognized better than anyone else we were running out. The old story was coming to an end, and we needed a new story. So if we look at this, I've talked about how for the Wii, most of the games were sold by Nintendo. Talked about the fact that for Microsoft and Sony, many of the games that were machines that were sold late in the cycle. The first few years of this cycle, there weren't that many PS3s and Xbox 360s to buy from. So the net effect of this was, for this hardware generation, if you were in the PS2 Xbox generation, and let me go back for a second here. Let's go back to the right frame. And you had a big hit, this is the size of the container in which you could put your money, because there were so many machines out there, over 200 million machines around the world in that era. But in the era of the Wii, the PS3, and the Xbox 360, we have Nintendo selling most of the games for the Wii, so that opportunity is reduced. And we have fewer of the other machines. So the same level of success, you only need a tank this big to hold all your money. The opportunity got much smaller. The upside got much smaller. By the way, these are water storage tanks. I'm from San Francisco, and in California, we are preoccupied with water. So water storage tanks are now my metaphor for everything. So picture your money inside the water storage tanks. But the impact of this, it isn't just, oh, we're selling fewer games. Immediately, as this pattern unfolds, something else happens. Here's a story from January of 2010, talking about 12,000 layoffs in the games business. Why 12,000 layoffs? Because the upside opportunity has been cut, because of the way the generation is unfolding, because the way in which we can tell our story of what business we are in is changing, and we have not adapted to it. So that's why I say that even as we pursue our creative paths, for myself as a designer and a studio head, we have to also learn and look at these lessons from history, because they will come and affect us with thousands and thousands of losses or thousands and thousands of new jobs. So if we look at what business we're in, I think we have some great examples. The words I'm using now for this is, I like to think that we are in the electronic fun business. And one way to think of this is, if I say to you, okay, you guys are now, each of you is in charge of new product development for our big publisher. I want you to come up with new ideas for great new games that will have even better graphics, better audio, bigger stories for making games better. You know, okay, how would I do that? Well, one thing we know is you need a really big budget and a really big team. But also, you know, what would I do? What would I be thinking about how I do that? That's kind of a hard challenge. Now if I say, okay, you're in charge of product development, I want you to come up with some ideas for new kinds of electronic fun. That's an easier idea. New kinds of electronic fun. There could be a small team, could be a big team. Could be any kind of game, because we're in the electronic fun business. There are examples of this, making better games in different ways. So World of Warcraft, obviously huge success around this same time period. They didn't make their graphics better. They lowered their graphic resolution and quality so that more people could play their game. So people with with older machines could play the game. They did the opposite of what everybody else was doing, and it worked. Words with Friends, really simple game, really basic level graphics, but got everybody playing with each other. People who would never play games would be playing on their phone with their friends. Big hit, big success. In fact, any game where you just go, oh, let me show you this, and you pull out your phone, which you always have with you. Now you can play games at any time, not just when you're home next to the big TV. You can play anytime. Oh, let me show you this. And we started to get thousands and thousands of new games that spread by, oh, let me show you this. And they weren't all about bigger, better, more resolution, finer graphics. We get touchscreen, where the touchscreen is what makes it fun and it's different. And those games prosper. So other kinds of games in the old narrow definition of what we do are struggling and having layoffs, but all at the same time. The best of times, the worst of times. At the same time, all these new kinds of games are prospering because they're thinking about themselves in a different way. So that's why when you're thinking about your career, your games, and what you're doing, right now we can look at these examples and see what's going on. 10 and 20 years from now, we will have new challenges. So keep thinking about asking yourself, what business are we in? Because you don't want to be like the VHS tapes and the buggy whips. You want to be one of the ones who keeps thinking about wide areas like electronic fun. Okay, idea number 3. This is opinion. This is my take from game history on what's going to happen with VR and Oculus and the other technologies there. One quick note before I talk about it, about vision and perspective. I am blind in one eye. I've been blind in one eye my entire life. So I don't see stereoscopically. And stereo vision is what gives us 3D. So for you, when you cover one eye, the way you see the rest of the world changes. When I cover one eye, you look exactly the same to me with one eye as you look with two eyes, because I don't have stereoscopic vision. So my opinions about this topic could very well be affected by the fact that I don't see the same way that you do. So I want to point that out, because if you disagree with me, that may be why I could be wrong, because I don't see things the same way. So stereoscopic entertainment is actually not new. The idea of creating a 3D effect. 150 years ago, they had stereoscopes or stereoscopic viewers. And what they would do is they would take a photograph of something from a certain angle, and just photographs themselves were new. We're just at the point early in the history of cameras and film. So take a photograph of something, slight offset, take a photograph of the same thing. Put it in the viewer, you put the viewer up to your head, you looked at the two images, and you got a 3D image. And for people in the 1860s, the 1870s, you can imagine how exciting this is. These are people who grew up where you looked at a painting to see something. Somebody had to paint it. There were no photographs. Now you could not only see photographs, but you could see 3D. And this technology was popular for 40 or 50 years. And just like the video game business, the viewers were cheap. They made their money selling the cards. In the 1950s and 60s, we had the same thing, but now they were on wheels, so you could have 6 pictures on one card, and you'd press a clicker, and it would rotate the card, the same idea. For about 20 years, these sold pretty well. Cheap viewers, and they made money selling you the cards. The first big studio 3D movie was House of Wax in 1953. As you can see, it's a horror movie. You can see how they were marketing 3D in 1953. And so people would go into the theater and they would get the cardboard glasses with the frames, with the lenses, and they'd watch in 3D, and everybody was excited, and people went to the movies to watch 3D. And so for a few years, 3D was a big deal. And then the novelty wore off, and people stopped coming for 3D, and 3D movies mostly went away. And then 40 years later, as we know, they came back again. Nintendo 3DS, successful platform. Not a killer platform, but a successful handheld. 3D television. This is actually a pattern breaker. All these other examples we're looking at were successful products. They weren't huge, but they were all successful. 3D TV, the makers spent billions developing 3D TV, and then it just died. For whatever reason, it didn't work. And it was unfortunate because Sony, which was fighting these same battles in video games, then got hurt by 3D TV at the same time, which kind of gave them a double hit. And Sony obviously has done a lot of wonderful innovation and has done a lot of wonderful things in our industry, giving us great platforms to work on. So this was especially tough for them. So what does this 150 years of history of consumers in 3D tell us? I think what it tells us is that Mark Zuckerberg is wrong when he says that VR is going to be the next big thing after mobile. So I disagree with that. Oh, Mr. Zuckerberg's agents are in the room. I think VR will be a nice category. I think it's going to succeed. I think it'll be a good business. But I don't think it's going to be big. My personal opinion is augmented reality over the next 20 years is going to grow into something really huge. But we'll see if I'm right. So after doing this for 45 years, I know there's nothing else I can do. So 20 years from now, I still hope to be doing that. By the way, that's one thing I can tell you absolutely that is not opinion, it's just fact. You can do this career. You can build games for 45 years and still love what you do and get up in the morning excited about working on games, because that's how I feel after doing it for 45 years. So that's one thing I can tell you as fact, that it's possible. So a different look at the console market for idea number 4. And in this, again, I'm talking about console a lot because that's where a lot of the drama has been, and that's where we can learn. But these are ideas we can then apply to any kind of game and to any game platform. So if you go back 25 years, Blockbuster had thousands of stores renting tapes to people, making billions of dollars, renting VHS tapes. And then Netflix comes along. Oh, I didn't want to mention, they were also renting games. And you can see here as late as the late 2000s, they were making about $225 million a year in revenue from renting games. And by the way, those game rentals, all through the 1990s and early 2000s, we'd be saying, okay, we're trying to make a great game here. We're also trying to make sure this isn't a great game that's a rental. How do we make sure you're not going to rent it? So that started to influence everything about design thinking, because this is money being taken out of the industry. Some people thought it was a little bit of money. Some people thought it was a lot of money. But it was money being taken away from great game creators and game publishers. So Netflix comes along, and in 6 years, they destroy Blockbuster. Because for Blockbuster, you would get in your car and drive with a car and no horse and no buggy whip. You would drive to the store, and you would get your tape and bring it home. And because of DVDs, Netflix would say, oh, I'll mail you the tape, stay at home. So we see Blockbuster go from $6 billion a year to zero in 6 years. Why? They were too narrow about the business they thought they were. We rent tapes. There's the problem. So of course, Gamefly sees this. And Gamefly says, I know what to do with this. I'll take game discs and I'll mail them to people instead of the game rental business. And by 2010, they had $110 million a year in revenue and were getting ready to go public. And of course, that's another 110 million. Is it 200 million? Is it 50 million that takes out of the games business? We don't know, but it takes something. And then GameStop, during the same period, and I wanted charts from the same time, is selling used games. And now we're not, before we were looking at revenue charts, now we're looking at charts just of profit, how much money they're making. And they get to where they're now starting to make each year. Not only is used games their most profitable segment, but they're getting to where even by the end of the year of 2009, January 2010, they're making well over $1 billion a year in profit out of selling used games. So that's over $1 billion a year of profit on some formula taken away from game publishers and game creators. So now we have dramatic change in this part of the business. So before I was talking about the problems of that generation and how we had our big water tank, our big game tank, going from big to small. What really happens when you combine these effects, when you have the problems of that hardware generation, and then you add the money that's being drawn out by used games and rental games, for the console business in some ways, it was like going from this to this, which further explains 12,000 layoffs just through 2010. So I think we have to look at the console business a different way, and if you're not in console, this is a lesson in how to look at your own segments. In my opinion, free-to-play has been part of the console business for 20 years. We just weren't willing to admit it. Because when rental games take money away from game sales, and those of us who make the games, whether we're developers or publishers, don't get any of that money, that means fewer jobs. That means that for the consumer, they're still paying for games. It's not free to play for them. But for us, it is free to play. Because we're building the games and then we're not being paid when people play them. And that was the social contract with our players in console. And because we refuse to admit that we're in a free-to-play business, we haven't monetized. We go around saying, we must defend ourselves. The barbarians are at the gates. We must have protections. We must have access limits. We must have restrictions. We must have codes. Oh, that's a great relationship to have between game designers and game players, is to be preoccupied with walling people out. What if instead of being preoccupied with walling people out because of these issues, the console business thinks about, it's another form of free-to-play. How do we monetize it? We know that monetization in free-to-play games can be an exploit, can be overdone, can be unfair to players, can create problems. But we also know there's lots of cases where free-to-play games are monetized and the players love the game and love spending small amounts of money over time instead of one big purchase. So monetization doesn't have to be a dirty word unless we make it that way. So if we think of the console business as having a free-to-play segment, and we stop thinking about attacking our players and walling them out, and we instead think about how we monetize them, again, we're looking at ourselves and our business in a different way. Now, I hear some people say, oh, that's very well and good, but in a few years, everything will be downloadable. And then you will see. GameStop will find its true course. They will have nothing to sell because everything will come directly to us. Ha 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 ha. Finally, we will have our revenge. Well, unfortunately, I think we know what digital dominance looks like. That's what digital dominance looks like. That's the place where we have digital dominance of games, is in mobile. What does digital dominance do? It gives us app stores, and it gives us tremendous downward pressure on game prices. So every good thing comes with checks. Every rose comes with thorns. And a few years from now, we're all going to be sitting around going, remember when we could get 50 euro for a game? Because we won't be saying that anymore. You might talk about lifetime value of 50 euro. But the idea of one big purchase, trust me, give me your 50 euro. Could I have 50 euro, please? You look like such a nice person. May I have 50 euro, please? That transaction, that deal, oh, I can actually see you now. It's so lovely. Hello. But I'm supposed to go here. That idea that we have that transaction where I ask you for 50 euro and you actually give it to me, that idea is on its way out. And if we think about it logically, with emotion, we think about, oh, that's normal. We've been doing that for 30 years. Most game developers were not yet born when we started this model of how our business works. But it turns out it's going to change. And we just have to accept that, and there are benefits and downsides. So one of the things I think about in business is it really relates to football, because you can either be passive and defensive or you can be aggressive. So if a team in a football match is ahead in the last few minutes, sometimes some coaches will pull all 11 players back into the defensive side of the field. And they'll just say, hey, I'm just going to play defense for the last 12 minutes. We're going to win this game and we're going to go home. And what happens sometimes? Sometimes the game gets tied and they even lose because they stopped trying to win. They stopped pushing ahead. Once you start playing defense, the rest of the world goes, oh, I don't have to play defense anymore. I can just be offense, aggressive, try new things. Maybe if I attack the goal this way. Suddenly, we give the rest of the world a great advantage over us when all we're doing is playing defense. So I don't like playing defense. I always want to find a place to be aggressive, to try and do something new. So the passive role, the defensive role would be to say, okay, I'll wait, maybe Don's right. Maybe it's going to go and it'll be when digital dominance happens, prices will go down, and then I'll learn some kind of free-to-play model. But I think that the aggressive way to look at it is just to learn free-to-play now and think about new ways to do it. The mobile game makers have also had just one way in which we've been used to doing this. People from console with different ways of thinking and thinking about the problem a different way may come up with whole new ideas for monetization that all of the mobile people are not thinking about. But we have to challenge ourselves to look at history before it happens, to do things in different ways. Okay, idea number 5, last idea. And this goes back to how we build world-class teams. If we're trying to build, Glenn was talking about building teams for Call of Duty. If we're trying to build teams that will do the world's best games, how do we do that? What motivates game makers? Well, I can give you a chart. I've run studios for probably aggregate 25 or 30 years. I can give you a chart of things that motivates game makers. So here's a bunch of things that motivate game makers, probably some familiar items there. And I'll also tell you, for those, if you have not yet led a big team, if you've not been head of a studio before, I'll prepare you for that. Because you'll notice I have both good light and darkness on this chart. Whenever we would change offices, some people would come into me and go, Don, whatever you do, make sure that in the new office, we have good light. We can't be in a dungeon. We can't be shrinking away like mushrooms in a cave. We have to have good light. Okay, I like that idea. That sounds good. Next person comes into my office. Don, whatever you do, we must have darkness. Darkness be my pillow, the soft place where I reside to create great games, to have the vision to focus only upon the screen with nothing else impinging upon my reality. These meetings are happening the same day, sometimes back to back with all the advice. And I joke about it, but you want to listen to the team because part of leading a team is listening and trying to create a great environment. Glenn was talking about some of these issues. So I think that's part of it, but I think there's other things. So part of it, reviews, or magazine covers, awards, interviews, having the team be recognized, having individual team members being recognized. I think that's important. But I think there are actually 3 things that are the most important of all. And ironically, in the last few years, I've actually changed my mind about this. I always believed in the same things, but I balanced them differently. I have completely rebalanced how I look at this issue the last few years. And now for me, these are the 3 most important things. So one is super talented teammates. If you are surrounded by brilliant people whom you respect, There are very few things that are more motivating and more make you feel like what you're doing is really worthwhile and this is a great team and a great place to work than to be surrounded by super talented people. And by the way, I think those super talented people need to also be people you want to be around. I have had wonderful arguments with friends who say, if somebody is absolutely great at what they do and they make the whole game better, I don't care if they're a jerk. I'll hire them anyway. I'll ask them to calm it down, but I don't care if they're hard to work with. I disagree with that. If somebody's a jerk, they can make money for somebody else. I will not hire them. Because if you go around making everybody else feel bad, you're undoing everything we're trying to do on a game dev team. So the talented jerks certainly will never work for me. That's my opinion. And that's part of super talented, because part of a talent is working together. And the jerks don't have super talent at working together. The second of the three things is leaders who follow through. And this is hard when you're being asked for light and darkness at the same time. And many other things like that. It's hard. I mean, what does following through mean? What does giving the team the right environment mean? What does getting the right projects mean? What does making the right choices mean? But doing what you say you're going to do is a central part of that for the leader, even in a conflicted world. And I think the third thing that is critically important actually comes down to the work itself. And here I go back to that baseball board game I played when I was a kid. If I wrote a letter to the guy who designed this game, as I say, ran for 50 years. If I wrote him a letter, I'd say, thank you, dude. This game was so important to me. This was my heaven in a world of hell. This is where I went to. This was my hook. You got me through a really hard part of my life with your game. And once we get into this business, what happens is we start to get those letters. People will come up and talk to you, or they'll write to you, and you say, oh, I love your game. And they never say, oh, I thought that the level design on level 11 was particularly well balanced, and I thought that... You don't get those letters. I will tell you, if you haven't had any yet, you will get them. What they are is, this is where I was in my life when I was playing your game. This is who I played with. And this is why it was so important to me that I wanted to write you this thank you note. And it goes back to that sentence, why it was so important to me. And when you get those letters, they say things like, my life was a living hell and your game changed it for me. And what that means is, I think, most important of all, how we build world-class teams is by the promise of doing something great. What our team is trying to do every time we set out, if we possibly can, is we are trying to do something great. Whatever our starting condition is, whatever our restrictions are, we are trying to do something great. Not something pretty good, not something that'll fit in the budget, not just something we can ship by February. But within those constraints, which we all know we face, doing something great. And I will sit in meetings both for my own team and for the teams I advise. We've got everything from a mobile game to 3 PC free-to-play games to a PS4 title that I'm advising right now. In all of those settings, sit there and say, okay, we're trying to figure something out. We're trying to do something great here. What is the something great answer? What choices do we make here to try to do something great? Because if we're trying to do that, that's how we will do something that mattered. And you notice I don't say do something that matters. I say that mattered, because we don't get to decide what matters. It matters to us as we make the game, but only the players decide what mattered to them. Only they decide if they want to send you the thank you note and tell you how you affected their lives, about how you made their lives better. So the greatest motivator for teams and the greatest reward we can have is that link to our players where we realize we didn't just, oh, I kept him from being bored at the bus stop for 10 minutes. That's nice. I enjoy I like doing that. I'm very happy doing that. But my highest goal is I want to do more than that. I want the letter that says, for some reason, even some tiny little simple game touched somebody's life and made somebody's life better. And if you give teams that goal, which you can do in any setting in some way, is give something that matters. That is the most motivating thing of all. And that is the special opportunity we are given as game makers. And I finish every talk I do with this same point, is that we have a privilege and a special opportunity as game makers to do this. We never want to waste that opportunity to do something that matters. So that's what I would say is my final idea of what's most important of all, is simply do something that mattered. Thank you very much. And I don't know what time we've got for questions, but I would be happy to take them.
So thank you for your talk. Did you ever think of mapping the prices not only to inflation, but to things like working hours or gasoline prices or something like this? And do you get the same correlations?
You know, it's interesting because I think that I see those as different scales. The gasoline prices I hadn't thought about, but I'll leave that to somebody else. I think that the issue of how we feel inside teams while we're building games is one issue, and how we can sell them is another, and how we want our players to feel is another completely separate issue. So to me, I don't believe you can mix those. So as a studio head, I went home many nights thinking about, okay, what is the experience of building the game like for the team, for the game makers? What is that experience like? And then other nights I'd be going home thinking, okay, how do we sell this? But they're really separate thoughts. And at least I'm not smart enough to figure out how to unify those, because I think it's actually a balancing act where we're trying to figure out if the team is happy, but what we produce doesn't sell, we'll all get fired and laid off. That's bad. If we are all happy, but the game sucks, we're going to be ashamed, and that's bad. If we're unhappy and we produce something that sells, everybody's going to leave, and that's bad. So we have to think of all these things. They are separate issues. The danger I'll give you one example of combining them. Many, many years ago, this is early history of games, I had an artist who produced some character designs that were on a play field, and the game was controlling these characters, and the characters were getting lost in the play field. They wouldn't pop, you couldn't see them. And so the artist was getting feedback from people, including me, hey, we need to make the characters pop more. They're just getting lost in the backgrounds. So play with the background, play with the characters, whatever, but we need to solve that problem. This is my vision for the game. I am an artist. And I'm only exaggerating a little. And I thought, okay, being trained originally as a writer, I thought I was going to be a playwright in university. I thought, well, I understand criticism. I get sensitive about criticism. Talked about more. No, and he was refusing to try to make the foreground and the background work better together. So I've always remembered that story because it's kind of like the Emperor's New Clothes, that story. Because there you have a choice between, here's one individual, I can make him very unhappy by saying, no, you have to do this, or we'll get somebody else who will. Or I can have a game, if I want to make him happy, I can have a game where you can't see the characters you're trying to control. And it's a super simple story. As a super simple example, it's easier to talk about. But the same problem comes if we become preoccupied with making the team happy today. We start to lose track of what's great. What would great feel like? What would a great game be? What decision would we make now if we're trying to make great games? And simultaneously, if we're doing, I want to build a great game. No, I won't loosen your shackles. Just keep working. That's not going to work either. We have to try and maximize both. But the only unifying factor, I think, is that idea of a great game.
Hi, Don, it's Oscar. Fantastic as always. I've kind of two things that I'm wondering about. The point you made earlier about the second-hand market side of things. Mm-hmm. So I kind of wonder whether that artificially propped up the price point. And that also then makes me wonder about where we are with free-to-play now. Mm-hmm. And what I'm wondering is whether the relatively huge amounts of money that we can make from not necessarily great games is blinding us to another potential problem later. Is there a similarity to that, or what do you think?
I think that set of issues is one. You can sit over a beer and talk about that. There's a lot of nuance to those, and I don't think there are easy answers. So, for example, on the question of, hey, I'm up here very confidently saying, yeah, rentals and used game sales take dollars away from our industry. There are people who argue that as a preview mechanism, as a way to try a game before you buy it, that actually helps drive sales. I don't agree with that argument on a meta basis, but I think there are cases where that's true. What is the ratio of how many dollars it brings us versus how many they lose? It's a great thing to argue over a beer. The fact that the rental market and the used game market could potentially be helping to preserve $50 and $60 and euro prices is a really interesting argument. And I think that a mathematician might even be able to put some support behind that. I don't know, but I don't think it's a ridiculous idea. So whenever we look at this idea of the things that drain money out of the industry as being purely, totally evil, I don't think it is that simple. And I like to joke about it and play with it when I'm talking. But in fact, all of us who've been involved in game design, we know. You start turning the variables, and typically you turn up a positive and you also increase a negative to offset it. Both the laws of economics and the laws of physics and God appear to do these same things. So it isn't so simple as all black or all white or all bad or all good. And I think you're raising a really important point that the same things I complain about, even if my ideas about what are negative about them are correct, that they also have some positive aspects they contribute, even if that part of the game design is deeper underneath the game and less easy to see. And it's fascinating stuff to talk about.
So a quick question. Do you think maybe that nowadays Let's Players and all these people have taken over the spot occupied by rentals in the 80s and 90s?
Who has taken over those spots?
The Let's Play guys on YouTube.
That's an interesting thought. So the idea that the influencers on YouTube and the demo scene and things like that have taken that spot, I think this all comes back to this whole question of preview mechanisms. For the entire history of games, we've sat around and said, I wish it was like radio. In radio, you listen to the radio, and for free, you hear music. You hear the songs you like, and then you go out and you buy them. I wish there were a way people could preview our games for free, but they'd still, if they liked the game, they would then need to go out and buy it. And as technology and times have changed, rental, I think, has negative aspects, but it was a preview mechanism. I think that all of the YouTube scene now, with all the different kinds of demos and influencers is part of that preview mechanism. Free-to-play itself is a preview mechanism. So I think, yes, all those things are related, but what ties them together is that idea of they are playing the role for us that radio has played for music. And yet music has had some of the parallel problems because recorded music as an industry has also plummeted in sales and driving artists back onto the road to do more tours to make money. So they're having their own changes just as we are. So I think it's a very good point. All of you, thank you. You've been a fun audience. I really appreciate QUO VADIS inviting me, and I appreciate you guys coming. Thank you very, very much.